I'm going to continue my unscripted videos by looking at a tool called Multipass, which I think is a fantastic tool for getting started with cloud native development and technologies. Basically, the use case is this. I want to be able to spin up a lot of nodes, compute nodes on Linux, and I want to be able to do that easily and quickly without having to pay Microsoft a lot of money for an Azure subscription, or any other provider for that matter. And maybe I want to test things like I want to use tools like Chef, or I want to use tools like Ansible. Maybe I want to start looking at how to configure my own Kubernetes cluster, and I want to learn, the process for doing that. Of course, I could go into Hyper-V, and I could manually create a whole load of Ubuntu instances. Multipass is basically a tool that takes that out of my hands and makes it extremely easy to spin up like for like virtual machines running Ubuntu. So you can go to multipass.run. You can download either Linux, Windows, or Mac OS distribution. When you install the Windows one, it's going to ask you what you want to use as your hypervisor environment, and I selected Hyper-V in my case. So I'm just going to bring up my two windows here. I've got a command prompt, which we're going to use to interact with Multipass. And then this is my Hyper-V manager. I want you to be able to see what actually goes on in the background there. So we're going to ignore, for the purposes of this, the 4 existing VMs that I've got. But what we're going to do is we're going to start with a multipass. Let's do a -H so we can see all the commands that are available. And the first one I'm going to start with is this one called start. So if I just do multipass start, start, it's going to say starting primary. So I've not told it anything else. I've literally just said, please start. And if we look over here on the right, momentarily, we should see a new Hyper-V instance appear, which is called primary. It's giving it a default amount of memory. Look at the settings for that. So we have 1 GB of memory, 1 virtual processor, which, if you look at your actual number of processors, so change my view to, there we go, we're already on the kernel view there. So I have 16 cores, so 1 virtual core is 1/16 of my system, which equates to 6%. Not ideal, but it's running. There's a disk attached to it. But, I had no involvement in the setup of this at all. It's just there, and it just works. The other thing I just wanted to note here is the network it was connected to as well. So by default, it has connected to my first network, which is my default switch. Okay. So if you just run multipass with no kind of specification of a machine, then that's what it's going to default to. So if I do, let's try multipass stop. Let's see what happens here. Stopping primary. So it's actually gone and stopped that machine. I can say multipass delete. I was going to say, well, hang on, you need to give me the name of a machine, or /all if you want to just delete all machines. So I'm going to give it a name there. I'm going to say primary. And you can see that nothing's happened. It still just shows us off. Well, if I do multipass list, we can see here it's aware of one machine called primary. Its state is deleted. Okay. Now what I can do is I can say multipass restore. Make sure I've got that right. It's actually recover, and I need to give it a name as well. So let's say primary multipass list again, and we can see that it's there and it's in the stop state. So I can say multipass start primary. It's going to restart that box. Give it a moment to finish doing that. Okay. And what we're going to do now is just to go back to the delete first. So when we delete it, it doesn't completely delete it. It leaves it as a configuration. There was a a command multipass purge. And what that will do is if there are any in the deleted state, at that point it will actually clean up the resources and it will disappear from Hyper-V entirely. Of course, we don't see that right now because I restarted, I undeleted it, I recovered it, and then I restarted it. So this box is good. So what I'm actually going to do now is if I connect to this through Hyper-V here, which is not what we want to do ordinarily, but it allows me to get in here. Well, I need to log in. Well, how do I log in? Well, I could try Ubuntu. Ubuntu, is that the default? Probably not. It's going to fail. And if you do a little Googling on this, you'll find out that the default instance doesn't have a default password. So there was it was deemed a security hole, rightfully so. So there's no way for me to log in here. So how do we work around that? Well, Multipass has a command called shell. So I was going to list the help, but it's actually still up here. We have this shell. Open a shell on a running instance. So I can say multipass shell primary, which is the name of the instance. And now I'm actually connected to the shell of that instance. So now what I can do, I can say sudo, because this is a super user command, password for the user Ubuntu. User Ubuntu does not exist. That's interesting. Is that just a typo there? Ubuntu. Ubuntu. There we go. So what do I want to set the password as? I'm just going to type something in real quick. Password was updated. So now I'm going to exit out of that shell and go back to this machine now. I can log in as Ubuntu, put in the newly created password, and now I'm in. That still seems like a lot of work, but at least you can see how you can actually get into this machine. With that in mind now, I should be able to SSH into the machine. So primary, let's do Ubuntu at primary. Now I'm not going to, well, that failed pretty quick. I was about to say, I'm not going to wait for it to fail. I'm not going to be able to access it because this is on my default network switch in Hyper-V. So, I actually don't have that connected to anything else. It's isolated. So there's no way from my local running machine I can actually access that network interface. And, I've kind of highlighted on a couple of out-of-the-box elements to focus on here. First off, I would say, there is the default username and password. We don't really want to have to manually intervene with that all the time. There's also the network that it's connected to. I want to be able to connect to this on a network of my choosing. I also pointed to the number of CPUs that it was using. So because I've got a lot of CPU cores on my host machine, that default of one virtual CPU can be quite limiting if I actually wanted to run a decent workload on it. So we want to be able to configure that. And then the final thing is all I've done here is spin up one virtual machine called primary. And actually I want to spin up a lot more than just the one, and I probably don't want to call it primary. So they're the things we're next going to look at to really try and get you a jump start on how to use this. So let's start by doing multipass. Let's just go straight for delete the primary. Okay, that's gone now. So multipass list. We can see it's in the deleted state. We'll do multipass purge. We should now see that disappear. It's even give me a message that I need to quit this window because it's been deleted. And there we go. We're now without any machines. Okay. So one of the tools we can use is the cloud init approach, which is not in my recents there. So let me just open up another side window here while I find that file. Okay, so I'm going to walk through what I've got in this file here. A couple of important things. This cloud init YAML, you can find this if you just search for cloud init. There's a site with full documentation on how to use it. But basically, we're trying to define a YAML file that we can pass to Multipass, so we can use that as a kind of base image, a base configuration. Cloud init is used way beyond Multipass in a lot of different environments. It's a good configuration management tool itself. We're just going to look at it just for this use case. So I've got a section here. All these comments in here have come from, the original file I downloaded the cloud init YAML example file. But let's just go through the ones I'm interested in here. For users, I want basically indicating who is the default user. The name is, I've gone for my local name, Omar M. My GCOS is basically my descriptive name, Omar McIver. The primary group for me is going to be users. I'm also going to put myself in the users and admin as my full group membership. This sudo option, this is set to false if I don't want this user to be a sudoer. If I do want them to be a sudoer, it's not just setting it to true. You actually need to give it this declarative instruction to say, what sudo rights I have and, whether I require passwords for particular things. So you can, again, Google that. If you Google even just this all equals all, you'll find a lot of documentation on it. We've got the lock password option, so we can provision a user with a password locked initially. We're going to set that to false. And then we're actually going to tell it what the password is. Now, how do we do that? Okay, well, if you're in Linux, you can use the password WD to be able to generate basically the hash. So this is going to be an encrypted hash of the password. I'm just trying to find where that's noted here. There it is. The MK password, you can tell it what method to use and how many rounds of 4096 bytes, and then it will prompt you for a password. On Windows, we want to use OpenSSL. So if I just go to my command window here, if you don't have OpenSSL, install Chocolatey. If you don't have Chocolatey, please go find out what it is and please install it. But you can just do a choco install OpenSSL. I'm going to cancel this because I know it's already installed on my machine, but now I've got that. Thank you for changing the color. Let's see if we can change that back. Oh, I forgot it was numbers. Sorry about that. 07. There we go. Nice little distraction there. So we can now run OpenSSL. We can use the password modifier there. We're going to use -1. Hit enter. It's going to say, okay, what's your password? So I'm going to type in a password. It's going to ask me to verify it. I'm going to verify it, and it's just going to chuck out this encoded string. So I'm going to copy that string. I'm going to go ahead and paste it right in here under my password. I'm going to save that file. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually do an SSH authorized key. So by setting this password, when we get to the point of provisioning an instance using this cloud init file, I can now log in with any provisioned instance with Omar M as the username, and the password that I typed in previously will validate against this hashed version of the password. So I'll be able to log in using that user account. I've also set it to sudo user, so I am in and I'm good. What I also want to be able to do, though, is I want to be able to actually authorize, maybe without the prompt all the time, and we use what's called SSH, public-private keys, to be able to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you how we come up with the value for this. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is we basically need to create a key pair. So we basically run SSH keygen. Okay, it's going to generate public-private key. It's going to ask for a file in which to save it. So I'm just going to save it as my new key. Okay, passphrase, I'm going to leave that empty. Okay, it's now gone ahead and created that. So now I should be able to do a list there, and I've got two files, my new key, which is the private key, and my new key.pub, which is the public side of it. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the pub key. So let me type that out, my new key.pub. Which you can see is this long string here. It begins with SSH RSA. It's a big long string. And then it ends in, you can see my username and the machine I'm actually connecting from. I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to go back to the file here. And I'm going to put that in as a SSH authorized key. Now this is an array, so I could go to the next line and generate another one and add that in there as well. But I'm just going to stick with the one for now. I'm going to skip over these other items here. In fact, I'm going to comment them all out. There's a lot of other configuration management commands you can run. So we can get it to do a lot of things on creation of the virtual machine. But for now, all I'm interested in making sure is that it's spun up with a default user with a particular password and an SSH, authorized key. Okay. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go into the folder where I actually have that file. I'm going to type out, I've created as a cheat this command just to remind myself of the options here. So I'm going to type them out and explain them. So we're going to do multipass launch. So unlike start, which creates a primary, multipass launch is going to create a machine. And if I don't put any other parameters in, it's going to give it a random name. So if you've ever worked with Docker, when you spin up a new container and you don't provide a name for the instance, it gives it a random name, like I don't know, Lazy Goliath or Champion Box or whatever funny name. It would do the same there. I actually want to give it a name and I want to give it more than that. So I'm going to start with the -c, which is to say how many cores do I want to give it. I'm going to give it 8 cores so it can basically have 50% of the compute power on my machine because I have 16 cores. I'm going to tell it that I want to use the cloud init file. And I'm going to give it the name of the file, which is the cloudinit.yaml we were just working on. I'm also going to tell it that I want it to connect to a particular network. External wired is the name of my network. If I look at my switch manager, there's my external wired. And then finally, I do actually want to give it a name. So I'm going to call this one Bob. I'm going to go ahead and run that. It's creating Bob. Which should appear very soon. Taking your time, Bob. You're taking your time. I'm not entirely sure what happened there, but I had to restart the multipass service. Maybe it didn't like the name Bob first time around. Maybe I've used that before. I don't know. Gremlins happen. You can see now it's configured and now it's starting up Bob. A couple of things I want to check here while it's waiting for it to initialize. Let's look at the settings here. Okay, so we've got 8 virtual processors, so that's 50% of my total machine resources. If we look at the network adapters, it's still connected to the default switch, but it is also connected to the external wired. So now, without needing to connect via Hyper-V, I should be able to SSH into Bob. Well, there we go. That's a good start. This is my local SSH saying I've never connected to this machine before. Can you confirm the fingerprint is trusted? I'm going to say yes. Okay, now it's asking me for my password. So let's see if that password worked. It did, and I'm in. So now let's exit out of that. So now we want to use the SSH key so I don't have to type in my credentials every time I want to connect. So what I can actually do is I need to do SSH add, and then I want to add in, so this is the private version of that key pair that we created. So we'll do that. That has now been added to my local registration for this session for SSH. So now I can do SSH Bob, and it's just straight in using that SSH key. Okay, so why is this good? Well, let me just type out that launch command again. So that launch command, basically batch file that I've created, has a %1 at the end, which basically means whatever command, whatever first argument I put in will be passed in there. So I can do launch command. So we've got Bob. Let's do Frank. And we'll give that a moment. Okay, so Frank is running. Taking a little bit longer than I originally thought. I'm actually going to do another one. Let's do Sean, Bob, Frank, and Sean. So while I wait for that to spin up, let's go to another command prompt. SSH into Bob. Okay, we're in. SSH into Frank. It's thinking about it. Okay, yes, it's my first time connecting. Yes, that's okay. And then SSH into shop. So the extra error, the extra confirmation there in SSH was just because we've got duplicate IP addresses using the same key because they all have the same fingerprints, if that makes sense. So that's a basic rundown of Multipass. What I now have here, if I do one more listing here, Multipass list, is I have 3 virtual machines spun up all very quickly with a consistent configuration but different names. I can expand upon that cloud init and develop that to whatever level of maturity I like, and then very, very easily fire up 3, 4, 5. You know, if I went for one vCPU and I really wanted to max out, I could build 16 machines. I could do 32, and they would just have to round robin their time on each core. You know, I can build out a local Linux-based cloud-native infrastructure here against which to develop and test. And then when I'm done with it, I can say multipass stop all. That's going to stop all my instances. Multipass delete all. Which now if I do a list, you'll see they're all still in Hyper-V, but they're listed as deleted. And I can finally do a purge, a purge. And those resources are all cleaned up. Hope this was useful. Let me know in the YouTube comments if you're on there. And thanks for taking your time for another one of my unscripted videos.